Hello guys, happy Monday. I don't like saying that right now because I'm recording this on a Friday. I don't want it to be Monday yet. So today we are wrapping up this slideshow. We have kind of chunked this up pretty well. I think we've done pretty small sections of this one. We wrapped up the other day talking about survivorship curves and the 3 different types there. So hopefully, I haven't looked at y'all's reading text yet, so hopefully we got that. It was pretty clear and straightforward. And we talked about K and R selected species, the difference between those two. And then we discussed these terms of intrinsic growth rate, carrying capacity, and environmental resistance. So now that we have all of that taken care of, we're going to finish this up and talk about population calculations, as well as different growth models. So that's that. This should be another pretty simple one. I'm going to move myself up here. Should be another pretty simple, few simple concepts to grasp, not too much to worry about. Hopefully an easy, not easy, but like a minimal effort way to begin our week, our last week before fall break, which is exciting. I don't have any plans, but still, fall break. Exciting stuff. So population calculations, this at first glance, this can look a little bit stressful because you've got numbers and you've got the exponents and subscripts and scary looking things, but I promise it's not actually that scary. Like, this is stuff that I am capable of understanding, and I've told y'all before I'm the world's worst at math, so if I can do this, I swear you guys can too. No problem at all. The main thing that you're going to need to know is just that the number of births that a population has minus the number of deaths that a population has is going to result in the growth rate. And that makes sense, right? Because if you've got 10 otters, I don't know why otters is the first thing that came to mind. If you've got 10 otters and let's say that, well, the total number of otters doesn't matter, but you have some otters and they have 5 babies and 2 of their elders pass away that year, then their growth rate is 3, right? So it's pretty easy to figure out. And then this slide right here, this might be one that you might want to pause me right now and make a note of this. Like, if you want to put it on a sticky note, if you want to just take a picture or a screen grab of this slide right here, you also have access to this slideshow, of course, in the folder. But this is just kind of helpful as like a little cheat sheet to know what each of the different variables and subscripts and things like that represent. So these are useful to know. We'll leave that at that. So growth models, I think these are pretty cool. It's okay if you don't though. But growth models are logical and I like them, and I like infographics, and I feel like it's just kind of like a nice little visual representation of what we're talking about here. Excuse me. So the exponential growth model is always going to be a J-shaped curve. And when it's graphed, so it's going to look like this. You've got this J. You got time on your x-axis and population size on your y-axis. Pretty straightforward, right? Essentially, exponential growth, it starts slowly. So we're like the growth rate, like we're kind of increasing, maybe a little bit up in here, but pretty steady. But then it really accelerates up in this area. It accelerates up to carrying capacity, which is going to be when the population is meeting that environmental resistance, right? So we talked about that over here, environmental resistance and carrying capacity. Remember, carrying capacity is the absolute max number or population size, the max population size that any environment can support, right? So the only, the max they can support, and that is limited by things that fall into the category of environmental resistance. So any factors that act to limit the growth of a population. So when the population reaches that carrying capacity, the most the environment can sustain because of environmental resistance, that's when the exponential population growth model would eventually kind of start to level off. Excuse me. The other growth model we're going to talk about is the logistic growth model. So this one, I like to think about it that the logistic growth model is kind of like the logical one, which is kind of like logistic, logical. I don't know if that's useful to you. Use it. Goodness gracious, we just ate lunch. So logistic growth is just going to be when a population, their growth is at the beginning, it is exponential. So at the start, we kind of are a little bit exponential right here. Like we're just kind of growing. It's really, really rapidly growing. Population size is increasing right here, right? But as that population starts to get close to the carrying capacity, which is normally going to be represented by a dotted line on the graph and represented by the letter K. So when we get to that closer and closer to that carrying capacity, the growth starts to sort of slow down a good bit until eventually that growth falls to zero because it can't grow anymore, right? Because they are at carrying capacity. Like the environment there cannot handle anymore. So when you're at carrying capacity, the growth falls to zero. And if you know that the growth is births minus deaths, that would mean that once their growth has fallen to zero, that means that their births and deaths each year for that population are going to be close to even, right? Because you want that growth to be zero to match this. So the growth, births and deaths will be fairly even. Logistic growth models are always going to be an S-shaped curve. It's kind of like an italicized S, but still, we've got that S-shaped growth model for logistic growth. There are some variations to the logistic model, so it's not always going to be that perfect S shape. Like that's like the ideal situation, the baseline sort of example, but it's not always going to be that simple. If food becomes scarce, the population is going to experience an overshoot larger than the spring carrying capacity and will result in a die-off or population crash. So two terms in this, I don't know if they ever break it down into terms, but overshoot and die-off are two terms that we're thinking about right here. Overshoot just means that like we're right here, it's a logistic growth model. It's like we're a little bit of growth, not that much. You got your carrying capacity right here with the dotted line. So the population's growing, that's great, everything's awesome. But here we are, we shoot way up past that carrying capacity. So we're way up here, but the carrying capacity of this ecosystem is right here. So when you overshoot that and you've produced way too many organisms for what that particular environment is able to hold, then inevitably you're going to have a die-off, which is the other term we're talking about on this slide. It's also sometimes referred to as a population crash. So we are like exponentially reproducing. Everything is great. We're having lots of children. And then suddenly it's like, oh, we just went way past carrying capacity. So now in order for balance to happen within that ecosystem, there is going to be a die-off or a population crash. So this is going to be when a large portion of that population dies off. And now we're back down here below carrying capacity. And you can see once that die-off happens, there might be another overshoot, another die-off, another, until eventually you can see that this wavy line is getting closer and closer together around that carrying capacity. So eventually it would stabilize pretty well. But something to think about. Looks like we have an example here with reindeer from 1910 to 1950 where they really, really overshot carrying capacity by like a lot. And then there was a very large population crash down here in the 50s. So there are several different types of population change that happen in nature. So we will talk about each of those. So looking at each of these, I think it'd be easiest for us to look over here at this types of population fluctuations chart in the bottom right. Some of the different options you've got are stable. Elephants are the example of that one. So you can see the red line right here is going to be our stable population. Like, yeah, there is a little bit of fluctuation in the numbers. It's not a perfectly straight line. That would be impossible. But it's a fairly stable population. You can know what to expect. You've got eruptive, like bacteria. So you can see this one right here, number of bacteria, and then hours that the bacteria is alive. It's growing, it's exponential, it's stable, and then it quickly dies off with a death event at 44 hours. So population surge right here, followed by a crash. You've got cyclical fluctuations, also known as boom and bust cycles. So that's going to be something called top-down and bottom-up population regulation, where basically there's a whole lot of reproduction and then a whole lot of death, and that's just kind of how the population goes. Pretty chaotic. And then you've got irregular, which is, I don't know, chaotic evil, in my opinion. I didn't mention, here's our eruptive, steady, big birth or growth event, and then big die-off, and then level again. You've got cyclical, or cyclic, I like cyclical better, where birthing events, die-offs, it's pretty consistent. And then irregular is just chaotic. You can see this purple or lavender line right here. It is attributed to chaos in the ecosystem, which makes sense. Examples of this are going to be things like the plague, potato famine, HIV, and AIDS, so things that are unexpected. It would be interesting to see population fluctuation in a chart as represented by how the coronavirus this year and last year has affected birth and death rates. Something to think about. I'm going to put us back. Let's see, I'm going to go up here. I don't want to cover up the hyenas. So we've talked a lot about different factors that can influence a population size. You've got density-dependent and density-independent factors. Density-dependent factors mean that the factor is dependent on how dense the population is, right? The size of the population is going to influence an individual within that population's probability of survival. Then within that, you've got the limiting factor principle, which is just the idea that too much or too little of any physical or chemical factor can limit or prevent growth of a population, even if all other factors are at or near the optimal range of tolerance. So too much or too little of anything isn't a good thing, no matter, even if everything else in the ecosystem was perfect, you don't want to have too much or too little of any specific thing. So limiting factors, again, that control population growth. Some examples of those are going to be like precipitation. Obviously, that's way more relevant when it comes to terrestrial or land animals. Terrestrial means land animals. So the amount of precipitation, the amount of light, water, space, nutrients, exposure to too many competitors, predators, or infectious diseases. Stuff to think about. And then if this would go away so I can see what that one said. Specific to aquatic ecosystems. We're going to exit out so I can see it. Hello. Okay. Specific to aquatic ecosystems is dissolved oxygen. DO is dissolved oxygen content, and salinity. So all of those are examples of some of those limiting factors. Some of the other factors, range of tolerance. So this got brought up over here. Too much or too little, even if everything else is in the range of tolerance, is a bad thing. So range of tolerance, it seems like it would have made sense for them to define that before they used it in a definition. But the range of tolerance is just variations in physical and chemical environment. Range of tolerance is like where things are able to thrive. So like if I was going to make a range of tolerance for myself, I would say I can only exist when it is between we're not even going to say that. We're going to say I can only exist between 75 and 105 degrees. I don't deal with the cold. I don't like it. I don't support it. I don't believe in it. So that would be me, right? That's me being dramatic. But you kind of get what I'm saying, right? The range of tolerance is how can they survive? So if you look at the chart here in the trout, I don't know why trout are always used as the example, but they are. Right now we've got trout and temperature. So when it's really, really cold over here, versus really hot over here, you've got the zones of intolerance, totally intolerant. They will not survive in those areas. There's no organisms at all. And that's going to be the absolute hottest and the absolute coolest. You've got zones where they are put into physiological stress. So they're physically and psychologically stressed out. Excuse me. There might be a few organisms, but they're stressy. Like they're not living their best life in this area. But then here in this middle range, you've got your optimum range. This is where you're going to see an abundance of the specific species, because this is where they do their best. So range of tolerance is like how much can they deal with in either direction. Hopefully I did that explanation justice. Okay, so we talked about density dependent. Now we're over here on density independent. And it's the same but opposite, right? So these factors affect a population size the same, no matter how big that population is. So the size of the population has no effect on the individual's probability of survival. This is often going to include climatic events, so things like tornadoes, floods, and fires. Fun fact, the first time I saw a forest fire, I was probably 11 or 12, driving down the highway. Well, I wasn't driving. My grandmother was driving because I was 12. But driving down the highway, and the forest was on fire on the road, like next to the road, and I cried. I didn't expect to cry, but I cried. And now I teach environmental science, so I guess it all makes sense. All right, so it's looking like that is going to be the end of this slideshow. We will, can I make this big? Oh no, I did the thing again. I always do this. All right, I figured it out. I can make myself bigger, apparently. So wrapping this up today, tomorrow we do have lecture on total fertility rates, Wednesday on human population dynamics and demographic transitions, and then Thursday we're going to have a fun little review day with live sessions to help prepare for the Unit 3 test, which will be on Friday. So go ahead and do your best to try to make sure that you look at your schedule for this week now, that you maybe look at like what's going on in your other classes, because and I've said this over and over, my classes that show up and they ask questions and they participate in these WebEx meetings, whether they be just like daily check-in or like more specific, like a review session like this, those classes do much better. Their class averages are points higher, like points and points higher. So do your best to show up and be there and participate in it. And if you just absolutely can't, then I would definitely recommend watching the recording of those meetings. So that is that. If you guys need anything, let me know. I hope you're having a great Monday.